Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today our guest is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
Oh, thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here. Doing great as always. Thank you.
Okay, just it was yesterday. There was a big celebration in Russia concerning the victory in Second World War. Although they don't call it Second World War, they call it
The Great
Russia
Patriotic War.
Great Patriotic War. To be exact, it's Second Patriotic War because the first one was against Napoleon. So Russian was victorious in the first, victorious war, and it made it again in 1945. Um, There are a lot of talks about the latest development in Russia and how they are tied up with this victory in this great patriotic war number two. Indeed, it was, if you want to go into history and understand the formation of a Russian nation, this victory was a cornerstone of actually finally make it a nation because they would feel the dignity of winning this war. Same as this, it was with the first Great Patriotic War with Napoleon, when Russians went through all Europe and they ended up in Paris and they saw the life in Europe, which had never seen before. And when they came back, what's happened was it was a decabrist movement and uproar and so same thing could have happened in Russia after 45. Well, it didn't happen because of the draconian measurements that Stalin's regime used against its own population, if you will. So the Russian nation hasn't been formed, unfortunately, yet. And now it's farther from that than ever. Because if you remember, the end of just 2021, when Putin, through his Lavrov and other Ryabov and other clowns, declared to NATO that take all your possessions. He's called it the Russian word manatki. Manatki means like schlep, some kind of a, very, very low esteemed word. So take all that and get out of here to the borders of NATO as it was in 1997. So that means that to satisfy Putin, NATO would have to leave Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and everything.
You would have to leave essentially the all of the most of the nations, most if not all the nations that formerly comprised the Warsaw Pact.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
just about to restore to the the end of the Cold War boundaries. And that is patently unrealistic. The Eastern European nations, former members of the Warsaw Pact, want nothing to do with Russia. They want nothing to do with being part of a reunified Soviet empire or Russian
That's the
empire.
only reason why they joined NATO and the European Union.
And that is the one thing that Russia is not willing to admit. They are not willing to admit that their former allies or their former members of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact no longer want anything to do with them. They want only to be part of Europe and to be part of NATO. And Poland going so far as to being willing to station nuclear weapons on their territory. As I mentioned before, they were willing to do that there. And if the Poles had got everything they wanted, they would not only have nuclear weapons stationed on their territory, but they would also have American troops on their territory, and they would also have ballistic missile defenses stationed on their territory. They would be asking for more patriots if they aren't doing so already.
Jonathan, but if Poland will get all that, the next one will be Finland.
Oh
Finland would
yes, without question, they're right up on the border. They have every reason to want ballistic missile defenses. All of the eastern members of NATO who are who are right up on the Russian border or certainly within missile range would all naturally be wanting to have the most sophisticated ballistic missiles defenses that they can get. And that is also part of why I've been recommending that in a future administration, that it should be joining together with NATO to create that global ballistic missile defense system with an upgraded as part of it.
Right. And
It's the only way you stop. It's the only way you stop a future war, by neutralizing Russia's one means of leverage. That it perceives as one means of leverage, its nuclear missile arsenal.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, if you think about it, that Russia, at least what they announced, that one of the reasons they attacked Ukraine, they didn't want to have NATO bases so close to Russia, that if they will put nuclear missiles in Ukraine, it will take 7 minutes to get to Moscow. From Finland, it will take 3 minutes to get to St. Petersburg and 4 minutes to Moscow. So what they have achieved by this...
They made the situation immeasurably worse from their standpoint. It backfired enormously. But now it's the least interestingly enough, by doing the one thing that I recommend that they fear the most, by adopting a global ballistic missile defense system, one that does not physically threaten Russia itself. It does not threaten to kill anyone. All it threatens to do is neutralize their means of leverage, neutralize their power.
But it's even worse.
Yes, of course. From their perspective, that's the worst possible thing. That's why the Russians reacted so vigorously to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, because they saw that, and that they were terrified. And from my personal research and my observations, when I was a brigade intelligence officer for 10th ADA Brigade Hawk and Patriot back in the mid-1980s, my brigade commander asked me to look at Russian military journals. Hey, Captain Lockwood, you read those Russian military journals. Why don't you check out and see if they're saying anything about Patriot? I looked at, as I told you before, I looked in the January 1985 issue of Vestnik Protivovostukhnoi Obrony, Herald of Anti-Aircraft Defense, and there was a media article on U.S. medium to high altitude air defense systems, and the last third of it was talking about Patriot. And the author, back in 85, and think about this, they were then saying that Patriot was a PRO, Protivoroketnoi Obrony, an ABM system, anti-ballistic missile system, designed for the strategic defense of the United States. They saw Patriot, in effect, as the leading edge of Star Wars, of the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's why they have been terrified of Patriot since the mid-1980s, if not before. And so now that the Patriot has demonstrated quite decisively that it is very effective against intermediate range ballistic missiles, the potential is there. All the components that are needed already exist. The laser technology, the spaceship technology, all the components required to completely neutralize not only the Russian nuclear arsenal, but the Chinese nuclear arsenal, North Korea's, and Iran's, all in one swoop, all at once, and in the most non-threatening manner possible. It doesn't threaten to kill anyone. It merely threatens to neutralize their means of coercion, their nuclear weapons.
Jonathan,
to me it is the perfect asymmetric response.
I had read the interview with one Israeli general, and he was asked a question: why, instead of Iron Dome system, or in addition to Iron Dome system, they wouldn't use lasers as the most effective means of defense?
Well, the reason I would contend, I would interject in there, the reason the Israelis would be reluctant to use lasers is that if you're using a ground-based laser or even an airborne laser, it requires much more power. The laser system itself has to be much more powerful in order to be able to punch through the atmosphere effectively and put enough energy on the missile in order to destroy it. And for a ground-based laser, it has to be pretty powerful and fairly big. Now, if you have a
Mhm. And
space-based laser,
recharge, it would need a lot of time,
right, and
energy to.
if you put a laser system on an orbiting starship, you put it in space and it's firing down through very thin atmosphere. It can put energy on on a missile that is coming up much more effectively and much more quickly. That is why boost phase defense is the optimum means for neutralizing a nuclear missile arsenal.
Yeah,
We don't.
also the Israeli general, he mentioned that in some weather conditions, may not be so effective, at least
Right,
ground-based.
because you get the scatter effect.
Yeah,
The lasers are trying to punch through water and other obstacles and turbulence, and so that it makes it more difficult for the laser to generate enough energy to destroy a missile, to target and destroy it. Even though the laser is moving at the speed of light, you still have the diffusing effect of weather, but you don't have that if you're firing from space.
absolutely. So, what I'd like to mention is that right now there is fairly large the military exercises of NATO powers, and there are, I think, 11 European countries and the United States. They're all participating, and they are learning about their successful um, action when Iran attacked Israel, and how they all work together, and they were even enhance these mechanisms. And Russia is not all too happy about it. So when just 2.5 years ago they said,
Go,
just get
go,
out
go.
of it.
Those types of exercises, Sasha, are the very kind of are a precursor. They are a foreshadowing of the kind of exercises that would be needed in order to make a global ballistic missile system defense system work. So if they're carrying those things out and learning to cooperate and learning to integrate their operations, that in itself is preparation for future possibilities.
Yeah, and obviously I don't think Putin is too happy about it. And then there was analysis that I went through possibility of a decisive Russian attack. That is, some Russians believe that it's imminent. It's about to start anytime, and most likely against Kharkiv. And they're bringing a lot of ammunition to Donbass region. They're trying to take over completely Donbass, which means Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And on the other hand, there was observation that Russia does not demonstrate any new weapons, ammunition. Um, the mm, the army new recruits, because all the recruits, most of them are gone, so they can only bring the new recruits to replace those that were already in mid grinder. And basically the tone was that it's highly unlikely that Russia has a potential for a decisive attack against Ukrainians who are just getting new weapons from the West, from the United States. So how, where, when?
You should be, as a result of the integration of these new weapons into Ukrainians' defenses. You should see a spike upward in the casualties that the Russians suffer in any new offensive efforts. They aren't increasing the quality. They aren't increasing. They aren't using any revolutionary new tactics or strategy. They're simply pouring in resources and hoping to grind the Ukrainians down. And that right now is a losing proposition, given the superior weaponry that the Ukrainians are acquiring.
So I started to think now that Soviet army by 1944 and 45 was much skillful and much more formidable entities than today's Russian army.
it would have been, and Sasha, the reason that the Soviet army of 1944 and 45 was as formidable as it was. Now, it's interesting to note that the further the Russians advanced during World War II, the Soviets advanced during World War II with their counteroffensives, their offensives were of shorter and shorter duration, because they were getting farther and farther away from their logistical base. They had to build up supplies. They had an even more primitive logistical system than they do now, and theirs was mostly horse-drawn wagons. And the only motorized logistical help that they got was, ironically enough, from the United States, from Lend-Lease, where they got a whole lot of Ford trucks. Those Ford trucks, the Russians love those.
Well,
yes, they got the only motorized logistical capability they got was from the United States, and that was what enabled the Soviet army to advance as much as they were able to, and to sustain their offensive right up to the gates of Berlin. But even so, even with that help, the Russians still had a great deal of difficulty, and had the Lend-Lease not been given to the Russians during the Second World War, at least in the form of motorized vehicles, then I would argue that it would have taken the Russians longer to actually get to the gates of Berlin, and it is quite conceivable that the Allies would have been able to take over the whole of Germany, before the Russians even got to the gates of Berlin.
Absolutely. And since I have heard some of the Russian speakers concerning the Victory Day, May 9th, and a lot of them remembered that even in 1960, their families were still eating American conserved meat from Second World War.
Yeah, sea rations. Yeah, for the canned rations. Yeah. Those kept for a long time.
Now, speaking about trucks, Russians have the huge shortage of trucks now. They need trucks on the front lines to move army, to move weapons,
and they can't call upon Ford trucks anymore. We're not giving them any trucks. So, okay, make your own trucks. Let's see how well you do.
Well, check out Iranians or North Korea if they're making any trucks that they can bring over to Russia. Well, that's hilarious. They're talking about the huge attack against Kharkiv, which is second largest city in Ukraine, 2 million people, and they want to take it over with 20 or 30,000 troops who just came over from.
Not likely.
Well, some estimation are that at least 150,000 fresh troops, or even 200,000, needed to take over this large city like Kharkiv. And where is this 150,000 or 200?
It's going to be brutal, Sasha. The Ukrainians are ready for it. They're braced for it. And you notice that they are continuing successfully their attacks, the drone attacks on Russian oil refineries. And the news is reporting that this is having a visible effect on the Russian ability. You notice that the Russians have canceled oil exports. And this is having a noticeable and increasing effect on the Russian ability to successfully wage offensive war in Ukraine. Now, all that remains, as we've been discussing in previous programs, is for the Ukrainian offensive, or to launch an effective counterstrike against the Kerch Bridge, to render it. The Russians have all but abandoned use of the Kerch Bridge, and also if they finish the job and render it permanently unusable, that would set the stage for the isolation of Russian occupation forces in Crimea. The Russian occupation forces in Crimea, as the Ukrainians steadily gained air superiority over that area, they become very vulnerable then to a Ukrainian counterstroke with its reserve forces that would take over Crimea and inflict a visible and decisive operational defeat on the Russian army, one that they cannot explain away.
Jonathan, there are more and more voices from Western intelligence and from Ukrainian analysts that, in fact, the Crimea is the most vulnerable Russian subject in this war, and Ukraine, once it will prepare for an attack after receiving all the help from the West and so on, to concentrate all their efforts on one thing, because that they may as well end the war. Just
Yeah,
the sheer,
that would be the single most decisive move. I would consider it analogous to during the American Civil War when the Union forces took Vicksburg. You recall Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. That was the last rail link that connected the western portion of the Confederacy with the eastern portion of the Confederacy. Once that link was taken by General Grant, it took place on the same days as the Battle of Gettysburg in the east. The Vicksburg was more decisive because it cut the Confederacy in half, and that meant that it could be defeated piecemeal. And so I would say that this would be the equivalent of Vicksburg for the Ukrainian effort, if it can, through offensive efforts, sever the link between Russia and Crimea, and then with a counteroffensive, take those forces and reoccupy Crimea. A big reversal of the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and one which would set the stage and put enormous pressure on Russia to, okay, time for you to cut your losses, get out of Ukraine, and now let's have at least an armistice.
Jonathan, very interesting thing is that Zelensky was lately criticized that he came with unachievable goals to get to the borders of 1991. Instead, he should have proclaimed his aim to get to the borders of 2022. But in 2022, Crimea would still stay with Russia. So it's a brilliant move to talking about 1991 just because of Crimea. You see, even if they will not be able to completely get Russians out of Donbass region, okay, so what Russians say, okay, so we are still trying to proceed in Donbass, not very successfully, but still trying hard. Oh, we got also this Bakhmut. Oh, we got Avdiivka. And we probably will get Chasiv Yar. If we will be lucky in the next few months, we will get Chasiv Yar. And here they are losing Crimea. So
right.
How about that?
If they lose it, and if they lose in Crimea, Sasha, this has a cumulative effect because the retaking of the Crimea by Ukraine frees up Ukrainian forces once they have reoccupied the Crimea, imprisoned the Russians, gotten them out of there, taken them prisoners of war, and so forth. This frees up Ukrainian forces to be redeployed to the east, in a potential counteroffensive to or at least certainly solidify the defense in the east to the point where it's virtually impenetrable. And as Ukraine eventually gains not only it gains air superiority over that area, then the stage is set again for a subsequent counteroffensive, if needed, to drive the Russians out of Ukraine altogether. And with NATO nations volunteering to send forces or volunteering to send various types of assistance, if, for example, certain NATO members agreed to send forces to Ukraine, not to fight on the front lines so much, but as to act as security forces, helping to rebuild, deploy in Crimea, to free up Ukrainian forces to reinforce and serve a counteroffensive in the east. This could be without engaging in direct combat with the Russians, NATO could provide troops to provide security to the Ukraine's rear areas, thus freeing up more and making the burden of carrying on the war much easier for the Ukrainian armed forces, and enabling them to concentrate their forces against the Russians in the east. And the Russians have no real recourse. They can continue to threaten to use their nuclear arsenal, and you notice they are doubling down on that. They are, They are using their they are continually talking about waving the threat of nuclear escalation over NATO, relying on our fear. They're trying to capitalize on Western fears and particularly U.S. fears of nuclear escalation. The only problem with that is that they actually do fire off a nuclear weapon or two, and the world does not magically come to an end for the West. Once you use it, okay, you have broken the spell. The mystery is no longer there. Okay, you've used it. Oh yeah, a bunch of casualties. Okay, now it's our turn.
And Putin will be number one target.
Oh, without question. So
he was already warned about it.
Right now, for the Russians, the threat to use nuclear weapons is more effective than their actual use of it. And because if they do use nuclear weapons, as I pointed out, even though Russia technically has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, it's not by that great a margin. And it certainly is not equal to the combined nuclear forces of the U.S. and all of its NATO allies. If you combine all of those, and if you want to throw in Israel just for grins, just for the fun of it, that margin increases even more. So
some Israeli missiles may by mistake hit Iran, but
so we're going to make they would make Iran a big case of collateral damage. It's just
but don't worry about it. You know what? But Russia more and more getting into international isolation, and trip of Emperor Xi to France showed very clearly that Macron told him that he expects China not to provide any weapons to Russia, and the dual-use materials that could be used for military or civil needs. And you know what she replied? Please, Mr. Macron, don't accuse China of doing something that we not only don't do, we have even no intentions of doing. Okay, so they just show that Russian trump card, the China will help, China will fight with Russia, it's our big brother, is complete fake. There's nothing behind it. China will do whatever needs to be done for China, and the biggest friends and partners for China are in Western Europe, in the United States, where the market is, where the money is. That's where China wants to go. They don't need Russia. It's a liability for China. What they need, what they can get from Russia.
More territory at the rate Russia's going.
More territory. They already have probably half of Siberia, if not more. A lot of women are very lonely in Siberia, Russian women. So there is no man for them, and will be even less in next upcoming years.
So the demographic problem is only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse.
Yeah. Now, finally, I'd like to mention that there are already big meetings in Western capitals and United States how to appropriate the Russian funds that are still in the West. And there are different estimates. Some people are talking about $180 billion, some others $280 billion. But right now there is an inventory count. So hopefully fairly soon we will know exactly what to do. So the first way of dealing with that, all the interest will be going into Ukraine, providing even more weapons for Ukraine, and eventually all of that will be appropriated and used for Ukraine, for weapon systems, for rebuilding finally Ukraine. Hopefully, so I think once Crimea will be taken, that will be time for starting to rebuild Ukraine, because I don't think Russia could continue the war without Crimea. And there is also danger that once Crimea will be taken, so next comes Donbass. So what will need it to actually take over Donbass? Ukraine will have to go to Russian territory like Belgorod and other places to encircle the Donbass. And I don't think that Russia will be able to fight this plan.
The once Crimea is retaken, that frees up Ukrainian resources and reserves to redeploy to the east, and the increased uh, means that the various NATO nations are supplying to Ukraine. The Ukrainians will be able to successfully integrate those and figure out the best way to use them, and this will increase their offensive capability, certainly at least to retake all of occupied Ukrainian territory. They will be able to do that. And as the Ukrainians continue to launch deep strikes, deep missile strikes and drone strikes against Russian refineries, against all of this is going to have a cumulative effect on the
Yes.
Russian ability to wage war. And so the contrary to what a lot of your more pessimistic Western analysts are saying right now, oh, this could drag on into 2025. No, I see the potential for it to effectively end this year. There's the potential, given the right combination of circumstances and the right timing, for the Ukrainians to make this Russian-Ukrainian war a moot point by the November elections. Even it could be all over but the shouting, and it sort of takes that out of the presidential election picture, really, if the Ukrainians can achieve a meaningful victory. And it focuses to other areas of more concern to the American public, such as the economy, which is and border security. Those are much more visible and issues of concern. And if the current administration is thinks that a victory in Ukraine is going to help them with re-election, I would point out, that George Bush Sr. thought he was in great shape after a victorious conclusion to the Persian Gulf War in 1991. But he lost the subsequent election.
That's a miracle. That's a miracle. I don't get it.
Well, because his opponents were successfully able to divert attention to, as James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid.
That's right.
And because the American economy was not doing as well as George Bush Sr. would like, George Bush thought that the victory in the Persian Gulf War would have given him enough credibility and with the American public that he was guaranteed a second term. Well, he proved to be wrong, because his political opponents very cleverly exploited the fact that the economy was not in the world's best shape. It certainly was in a lot better shape than it is now, but then they were able to successfully make that case, and Bill Clinton successfully made the argument. So don't count on foreign policy victories to decisively affect an American election. The exception to that would have been World War II.
Yeah, I agree. Jonathan, I remember very well that time. I'm talking about March, April 1991. I was working as a musical director on Sea Goddess 1. It's a Cunard line. And the old ship, and it was 6-star luxury ship with 100 passengers and 120 crew. It was all taken over, fractured by GE Capital. And the celebrations were huge. People getting on the ship, they had like short 5 days cruises, and they were changing public, and they were bringing their favorite customers and people and workers, and just it was madness. It was such celebration after this victory in Gulf War, and it was the happiest time. And I witnessed all that. I couldn't believe that Bush Sr. may not win the election. It was incredible. Election was next year, 92. But still, it was like the height of American victory and power and celebration and good feelings. And
American elections are full of surprises. Just remember back in 2016, on the eve of between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Everyone was saying on the eve of the election, all of the media were saying, oh, Hillary Clinton has a 99% chance of winning the presidency. Right. Until here come the returns, And yeah, she was going to be the first female president until she wasn't.
Yeah, well, strange things happening, and
Yeah. So
this election will be unique because speaking about
yeah,
two 80 years old, well, one is actually over 80, well, almost 80, they're going to find each other, and Trump is going through his trials piece by piece, and so on, and so there are so much is really unknown.
there is a lot. There is a lot of play left in the surprises this year, and certainly in this war. Although I am projecting based on the way current trends are developing and the potential of various technologies to have a decisive effect on the Ukrainian battlefield, that events are going to greatly favor Ukraine in the latter part of this year.
Agree. And by the way, I've heard just on the way here comments about Republican Party in Congress. They are no longer support anti-speaker position to remove him and so on. And the people from they call them Reaganist Republicans, something like this. Have you heard about that terminology? It's people who are not necessarily with Trump on all issue, but they're taking more conservatives like Reagan's like approach, that they are taking more and more control over the Republicans. Maybe one of the reasons is that Trump is busy with his trials all the time, especially now with criminal trial. He must be there almost every day except Wednesday. So maybe that takes a lot of his time and attention, and people in Congress, the Republicans, started to feel that well, they're no longer supposedly have to follow every his move and word and whatever it is. But we'll see how it will develop. It's all will unravel in the next few weeks, I'm pretty sure. In the meantime, I'm happy to say that in the last few days were very, very useful for Ukraine on many directions. And one of the commentators, the military analysts, say that all Ukraine needs is to stand solid for the next 3 to 4 weeks. And that's it. From that point on, nothing will be able to move Ukraine. Ukraine will prevail.
They'll be in a very solid defensive position, and they will have, I predict, the opportunity to deliver a decisive offensive counterstroke in an area where it counts most.
Yes, that's where it all goes. Jonathan, thank you so much for today's program. Have a great weekend, and all
You
of
do the same.
And we'll see you next Tuesday, same place, same time. Bye-bye,
Great.
everybody. Glory to Ukraine. Bye, everybody.